Let's turn our focus, yes again, to the Labor election loss, but with a bit of a different angle today on what's happening not just with Labor in Australia, but centre-left parties around the world, why they have been failing in anywhere from the UK to the US to Australia. Joining me now is Brett Gale, Executive Director at the Chifley Research Centre. Thanks very much for your time, Brett Gale. The failure of the centre-left, you're arguing, is a global one, not just about Labor. What's the mistake then being made by everyone, not just in Australia by the Labor Party?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Great to be here. Look, I think what we've seen around the world is that social democratic parties, the centre-left, had for 40 years built this coalition of progressive inner-city types, if you like, in the Australian context, and workers. And I think what we've seen in recent elections is a cleft, a fissure opening up between those two coalitions, and that is really damaging centre-left parties. And I think particularly in Europe, what we've seen is when the global financial crisis hit, centre-left parties were still stuck with sort of ideas of supporting neoliberal economics that they had been supporting throughout the 90s, and they didn't really update their policy suite to take into account the changed circumstances that the GFC brought about. And most of them were in power at the time, and since then I think the general public has revolted against the centre-left and their offerings.
It's an interesting point to pick, the GFC, because Labor talks about how it saved Australia from a proper recession during the GFC. So what happened then? What, it didn't turn its attention to what had truly changed? It was sort of, well, we did the short-term economic stuff, we pulled the right levers, and perhaps there was a bit of an asleep at the wheel sort of approach, or was it just a turmoil going on within Labor?
Look, I think of all the social democratic governments that were in power at the time, Australian Labor was the only one who responded with a expansionary stimulus type package that wasn't stuck in the nostrums and policies of the 1990s. I think then, of course, yeah, I think it would be fair to say that Labor sullied its own brand with its internecine fighting that occurred from sort of 2010 onwards. So it wasn't able to talk about its own achievements then. As well, by skipping a recession, if you like, in Australia, I don't think the public actually gave credit to Labor for what it actually had achieved.
You talk as well about the right going to this sort of populist element, and you say part of it's populist rhetoric, but nonetheless effective. Could Jeremy Corbyn be seen as an experiment in going populist on the left, and perhaps right now a failure?
I think the Jeremy Corbyn experiment is very interesting. I mean, I think part of the problem for British Labor, and of course, given that it is 600 different individual by-elections with first-past-the-post system, so it's quite hard to predict what will actually happen. But I think part of the reason why British Labor is languishing in the polls at the moment is that that two-thirds of the party think it's 1977 and have policy prescriptions from 1977, and the other third, the Blairites, still think it's 1997. I think all social democratic parties around the world are grappling with actually what does social democracy in the 21st century mean.
Yeah, I suppose the Corbyn factor might be a bit of a one-off, but just strikes me that given all what's going on there, he hasn't been able to capitalise on it. You mentioned as well Labor should feel comforted in Australia by having a lot of people, a decent amount at least, living under Labor governments at a state level. Could it be an element of people feeling as though Labor does the services well? You can trust them with health, education, maybe even policing to an extent, but they're not much chop at the helm of the big economic levers?
I think that federal Labor can learn lessons from state Labor as to why state Labor governments have won in recent years and why they are continuing to win. You know, we see a lot of talk about Labor's dead and it's an existential crisis, but what I've been trying to say with the piece I put out today was, actually, if you look around the country, more people than not live under Labor governments. And for us at a federal level, we need to look at the lessons from those state governments, see what worked, see what they've taken to the election, and see how they've won and how they've managed to stay in government. And I think there are very salutary lessons there, but I think the real message is, while a lot of us felt despair and sadness at the unexpected election result, the time for sort of the rending of garments and the still gnashing of teeth and wailing about the existential crisis of Labor should be over, and that what we need to do is look towards the future and begin the policy rebuild for the future and what Labor will take to the next election.
All right, well, finally, just on that, is there any particular lessons? I know Labor's been reluctant to sort of pinpoint policy so far, but you're not as shackled, Brett. Anything they should definitely avoid or definitely go to?
Oh, look, I think the approach that they've done is the right thing. I don't think that straight after a big election loss like this, with three years till the next election, that they should be spooked into throwing everything out. I think what's needed is a calm, methodical approach. That's why Chifley's bringing together 80-odd leaders of the party and others, plus an audience of well over 350 people next weekend to start the policy discussion on what Labor needs to do going forward. I think hasten slowly is the actual advice I'd give to Labor at the moment.